If you're feeling a little pessimistic about the future right now, you're not alone. Politics, as usual, seems to have gone stale. All the energy seems to be with the people who are shouting. Rutger Bregman thinks we can do better than that. Rutger is a Dutch historian and author who writes about history, economics and philosophy. His most recent book has a provocative title, Utopia for Realists, and it's become an international bestseller. Some of Rutger Bregman's ideas are completely at odds with conventional thinking today, and they are likely to seem crazy to some people. Ideas like a standard basic income for everyone. No strings attached, no matter what you do. Free apartments for the homeless. Fewer hours at work, more job sharing. And he says there are far too many highly paid jobs that create little or no value and induce a kind of despair in the people that hold them. Shouldn't there be more support for people who actually create value and contribute to society? People like teachers and bus drivers and farmers and garbage collectors. Much of Rutger Bregman's insights come from his research and other people's research into the nature of poverty and why poor people apparently make poor life choices. He says it's this hard data that led him to realise that everything he thought he knew about poverty was wrong. Hi, Rutger.
Hi there.
I want to start with a story you have in your book that takes place in 1974, more than 40 years ago, in a town in Canada called Dauphin. Just first of all, what kind of a town was Dauphin in 1974?
Oh, just a pretty small rural town. I think about 10,000 people live there. So
this is somewhere out in the prairie lands.
Yeah, it's close to Winnipeg, which is a bit larger.
And there's this couple in it you mentioned. They're called Hugh and Doreen Johnson, and they've got two kids. They both work, but their wages are really minimal. They're just getting by. And then one day there's a knock on the door. Tell me what happens after this knock on the door happens to them.
Well, there were two men dressed up in suits there, and they basically said, do you want free money? So what started there in Dauphin in 1974 was a really fascinating and radical experiment. What they did for 4 years is completely eradicate poverty. So it was called the town with no poverty. And they did it just by topping up the incomes of everyone who fell below the poverty line.
So they didn't flatten everyone's income, they just lifted up the bottom incomes.
There was a floor in the income distribution. You couldn't be poor anymore.
You couldn't be poor anymore. Okay, so what kind of money were they being given on an annual basis then?
Every month, actually. So they reported their earnings every month, and if it was not enough to get you above the poverty line, then it would be supplemented. And the income support would sort of phase out with a tax. And this is what we call a basic income.
And what conditions were attached to this free money?
None at all.
None at all?
None at all. You only had to live there, and it was absolutely unconditional. You were completely free to decide for yourself, what you wanted to do with the money. You could spend it on drugs if you want, or alcohol, or whatever.
Was there plans to roll this out nationally in Canada?
Yes, absolutely. This experiment was seen as just the last trial before it would be rolled out nationally. Not many people know that at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, almost everyone from the left to the right believed that this kind of policy was going to be implemented both in Canada and the US, and probably soon after that the rest of the world.
The left and the right were talking about this?
Yes, exactly. I mean, Milton Friedman, the famous neoliberal economist, was also in favor of this, of the guaranteed annual income.
How long did this scheme in Canada, in Dauphin, last?
4 years. 4 years. So they did it for 4 years, and there were a lot of economists, sociologists, anthropologists who all descended on the town and did their research. So they did interviews, they collected a lot of data, made interesting graphs. What would people do with the money they received?
What happened after 4 years?
And this is where the story gets a little bit sad. So a new government was voted into power, and that new government thought, this is a really weird experiment. What are you actually doing? I mean, you're just giving free money to people. Stop this at once. And so there was no money left to analyze the results. And the researchers had to put all their files away in 2,000 boxes. And then for 25 years, everyone forgot about it. It was there in the archives, and no one had done the research.
So no one had processed this research?
Exactly. So we didn't really know what the effect was. And actually, some of the researchers were also a little bit afraid to analyze the data because they thought that it would show that it had been a huge disaster.
Yeah, what were some of the kind of more negative predictions about that program, the things that were predicted would most likely occur?
Well, I mean, people have two objections mostly to this kind of idea. The first one is that we can't afford it. It's way too expensive. And the second one is obviously that people are just going to stop working and that they'll be lazy and use the money to buy more drugs and alcohol.
And watch TV a lot, right, yeah. And so when someone finally did find these records, what happened then?
Yeah, this was just a few years ago, actually. A Canadian professor, her name is Evelyn Forget. She heard about the records, she tracked them down and did the analysis, worked for a few years on that. And, it was pretty amazing. What she showed that it was a tremendous success.
Success by what yardstick?
By so many yardsticks. So, I think the most important finding was that Evelyn Forget discovered that the hospital admissions decreased by 8.5%, which is huge. I mean, we spend so much money these days on healthcare, so that was quite a significant finding. But kids also performed better in school. Crime went down. Domestic violence went down. Mental health complaints were down. It was quite a success story.
What about the predictions that people would quit their jobs and just live on this minimum basic income?
Just didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
So the total amount of work hour reductions for male breadwinners was 1%, and this was totally compensated by people doing other useful stuff like, caring more for their kids or for the elderly, of being longer in school. Yeah, so the prophecies of doom just failed to materialize.
I can see the kind of connection between better performance at school, because if parents aren't working all the time in hard scrabble jobs to try and working overtime to bring in an extra dollar, they've got more time to look after their kids and attend to their schooling. Why hospital admissions though? Why did they go? What's the connection there between the reduction in hospital admissions with the introduction of a universal basic income there?
Well, poverty creates so many problems, and worse health is just one of them. I think that we often forget that poverty is just incredibly expensive, in terms of higher healthcare costs, higher crime rates, you pay more for the judicial system, et cetera. And it's basically an investment to eradicate poverty itself. And I think that the data even shows that it's an investment that pays for itself. So the savings are actually bigger than the cash grants themselves.
Are you saying that the results showed that the introduction of this minimum income scheme, this introduction of free money, saved money?
Yeah, and in that sense, it's literally free money. We've sort of forgotten to think about social policies in that terms these days. Usually the debate today goes like, the left says we need to do this because it's our moral responsibility to help the poor. And then the right says, yeah, sure, but we can't afford it. Now, what I think is that there's a huge amount of evidence that these kind of policies, just pay for themselves. They're great investments with a huge return.
You mentioned there that there were proposals all around the world, in the developed world anyway, to introduce a similar scheme, a universal basic income. Had this been tried elsewhere? And if so, what kind of results were cropping up in these other places?
Well, as I said, it's a completely forgotten episode in American history and in Canadian history that we trialed a lot, actually, with basic income in those times. So there were huge experiments in the US as well, with thousands of people participating that basically had the same results. So again, healthcare costs went down, crime went down, kids performed better in school, and people didn't quit working. Sometimes they quit a job that they thought was completely meaningless and look for another more useful job, which is a great thing, I believe. But that was mainly the results. Now, there was one problem though, and that was in 1978. There was a big experiment in Seattle where researchers found that the divorce rate had gone up by 50%. So as I said, the right and conservatives initially were in favor of basic income, but when they heard about this, they were like, we can't have basic income. This will make women much too independent. We don't want it anymore. It was only 10 years later that researchers found out that a statistical mistake had been made. So in reality, the divorce rate did not go up. But it's one of the many, many bizarre ironies of this history.
You wrote that President Nixon in the 1970s, a Republican president, was interested in introducing such a scheme in the United States. How far did he get with that?
Well, he was almost there, actually. At the end of the 90s, there was a letter on the front page of the New York Times that was signed by 1,000 economists, all calling for a guaranteed annual income. And there were economists from the left and the right. As I said, Milton Friedman, the right-wing economist, but also John Kenneth Galbraith, quite left-wing economists. They were all in favor of this. Martin Luther King also was in favor of a basic income. And Richard Nixon just thought, it wasn't the case that he was the big man with the big idea. He just thought, all right, let me be the president that makes history. So he had a bill for modest basic income that got through the House of Representatives twice, But then it was killed in the Senate by the left, by the Democrats.
The left killed it?
Yeah.
Why?
They wanted a higher basic income. They thought this is going to be implemented anyway, so let's just kill this bill now, but there will be another bill in the near future. Because this is the future anyway, they believe.
The thing about the experiment in Dauphin was that there were no strings attached to the payments. So it came as more of a right than as a privilege, if you like. Yeah. How important is that idea that there are no strings attached to the payment of this free money?
I think it's absolutely crucial. If you look at the welfare state right now, and in the past 30 years since Reagan and Thatcher, it has become more and more conditional, more and more paternalistic, and quite humiliating for the people who are in it. The real experts on the poor's lives are the poor themselves. Poverty is not a lack of character, but just a lack of cash. We just have, a way too large bureaucratic industry of paternalists. It's just better to hand out the salaries of those people to the poor who really need it.
So I'm beginning to see why the right might get behind this now. If you get that means really getting rid of welfare as such, doesn't it?
It is a combination of right-wing and left-wing thinking. I mean, the right is true when it says that the welfare state, keeps people down at the bottom of society. It is true. I mean, there are so many mechanisms that enforce that.
What you're talking about, the payment of a universal basic income, would eliminate those giant bureaucratic apparatuses and machines, if you like, that are put in place to look over the shoulders of welfare recipients.
Exactly.
To make sure that they're spending it wisely, that they're doing this, they're doing that, they're still applying for
exactly.
work.
And behind that just lies a different philosophy, if you will, of what poverty actually is. And that is maybe the most important point here, is that both people on the left and on the right completely misunderstand what poverty actually is.
How do they do that?
Well, what the right often thinks is that, poverty is some kind of character failing, right? That Margaret Thatcher famously said that poverty is a personality defect, lack of character.
Well, a lack of willingness to work?
Yeah.
Laziness,
a lack of,
right.
The willingness to take responsibility for your own life, etc. And the idea is then that we have to push people into work or teach them how to, be responsible. Now, the left obviously doesn't put it like that. But what it does say is, let's help people, to make better decisions. Let's guide them, let's give them money management training. Let's give them courses for the unemployed. Let's help them to set up their LinkedIn profile or something like that. And the assumption behind that is the same. It's, again, the assumption that there's something wrong with the poor themselves. So I think that the left and the right basically agree on that there's something wrong with the poor.
It also assumes that they have better information than the poor themselves.
Exactly.
It assumes that they know better than poor people themselves.
It's a quite arrogant position, if you put it like that.
So tell me about the research that changed. This is part of the research that changed your mind on this. What do you now understand to be at the root cause of poverty, and why poor people often typically make poor life choices? Well,
the experiment that really changed my mind was a breakthrough article in Science a few years ago. And what these researchers did is they went to India and they worked with a group of sugarcane farmers. Now, these farmers receive about 60% of their annual income all at once, right after the harvest, which means they're relatively poor one part of the year and rich the other. So then they did something very simple. They gave them an IQ test before and after the harvest. So while they were poor and while they were rich. And the difference was 14 points in IQ. Now, to give you an idea, that's comparable to losing a night's sleep or the effects of alcoholism, which means that, yes, it is true that the poor often make poor decisions. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that shows this. But it has nothing to do with the poor themselves. It is just the context of poverty. We would all make very, worse decisions if we were in the same context. So how do we solve that problem? Get them out of poverty. That is what we should do.
So what is the root cause of poverty then? What is, if it's not some kind of character failing, what do you now believe it to be?
It's just a lack of cash.
Poverty is just a lack of cash.
It's just a lack of cash. Yeah, it's when I say it like this, it sounds like, oh, wow, that's a big breakthrough finding. But that's just what it is. And it's pretty easy to solve a lack of cash. I mean, just give cash.
There are different examples in your books, your book, of other schemes that have taken place. There's another story about the Cherokee Indians of North Carolina and what happened when they were given the legal right to open a casino on Cherokee lands. Tell me what happened there.
This is another fascinating piece of research, and it was a big coincidence actually. There was a professor who had started a study among about 1,500 children and, their mental health and lots of other stuff. And then during that study, suddenly a casino opened. And the casino was operated by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And they were free to, do with the earnings whatever they wanted to do. And they decided just to give it to the members of the band. And it was quite a lot of money, It was a very profitable casino. So at some point, the cash transfers reached a point of $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And
a month or a year? A year.
A year. Yeah.
And so they're being paid out like shareholders, essentially, then, on a dividend, essentially, from the casino.
Exactly. So this was sort of a basic income. And a lot of the members of this band lived in poverty. So it was, it was a golden opportunity for these researchers to look at the effect of what actually happens in a basic income. Now, again, they saw the same results as in Dolphin and in the US experiments. Is that, health improved, crime went down, kids performed better in school, et cetera, et cetera. But what was even more fascinating is what an economist, his name is Randall Key from UCLA, found out later, is that the savings in terms of lower healthcare costs, et cetera, were bigger than the cash grants themselves. So it was another piece of evidence that shows that this can actually work.
You were saying that the research does back this up, that poor people do often make poor lifestyle choices, and that's often there's some kind of a terrible shrinkage that takes place in their ability to, compute their lives, I suppose, once there's enormous scarcity and the tension and stress of that in their lives. Tell me a bit more about what's going on there and the kind of relentless short-termism that comes into play when people are enduring poverty.
Yeah, well, it's probably good to compare it to being busy. If you're really busy, you have a very short-term view, right? You think about, the email you've got to finish, or, that appointment that you got to rush to, and you're going to make mistakes if you have that rationality. Now, you should just imagine that the poor are in that state all the time. And the thing is, you can't take a break from poverty. Like, if you're busy, you can, you can go on vacation or something like that, or call your employer and say, I'm really too busy, can't do anything anymore today. But the poor can't do that. They're always in that mindset. They're always focused on, how will I reach the end of the week? Living from paycheck to paycheck. And that means that in the long term, you're going to make a lot of decisions that are not very good for you. You're going to raise your kids less well, you're going to eat more unhealthy, and all sorts of things. So
are you calling then for a universal basic income to be introduced in advanced economies, all economies, right across the board? What exactly are you calling for here, Rutger?
I think that developed countries should have done it 40 years ago, actually. Back then it almost happened, and we missed sort of our opportunity to do it. But it's really exciting to see the idea spreading around the globe right now. I mean, just a few years ago, it was completely forgotten. When I started writing about it in 2013, almost no one knew what it was. And now it's pretty much everywhere. Like Canada has just announced a big experiment. Finland has already started one. It was just in the news that Scotland is also going to do an experiment. So, I think we have little time to waste. But it's also a promising idea for developing countries, actually.
Well, here's the problem that I think I can see with this, which is there's something in human nature that just rebels against people getting money for nothing. If I'm working hard, I pay my taxes, you're going to take money from me and give it to someone without no strings attached, no matter what they do, and they can sit around all day. Even if maybe the research shows that that's not what happens. There's something in human nature that rebels against confiscation of someone's wealth to hand it to someone else who can choose to work or not choose to work. What do you say to that?
Oh, I think it's really important that we use different language here. There's one place in the whole world that sort of has a basic income. It's Alaska, and it's a basic income of $2,000 a year. So, it doesn't get you out of poverty or anything, but it's significant. And it's financed with oil money. And it's really seen as a dividend that you just, it's not a favor, but it's just a right that everyone receives. Now, if you want to get rid of that policy in Alaska as a politician, you're finished. It's incredibly popular. Right. So we should really see the basic income like that. It is a dividend of progress. Because our forefathers worked so hard to create all this incredible prosperity that we have today. We are wealthier, we are healthier than ever. All these institutions, all these technologies, etc., that we didn't create ourselves, but were just given to us. right? We were just lucky to be born in this world.
Right, so we're like the rich kids who've inherited the fortunes patiently built by our predecessors in a way. Those of us who live in these developed countries.
It's just a collective inheritance. And a basic income is a recognition of that fact, that everyone deserves a part of that pie.
Your book's called Utopia for Realists. You want to reintroduce the idea of utopian thinking. And you begin with this perspective that we do live in this land of plenty. Despite the kind of sour note that a lot of politics has in developed countries these days. Can you give us a bit of perspective on this kind of land of plenty that we've arrived at now in this time compared to, say, 200 years ago?
Well, I start the book with what is probably the biggest lesson of all of human history, and that is that in the past, everything was worse. It's something that you don't really get when you watch the news a lot. I mean, when you watch the news, you hear about corruption and crises and terrorism, etc., and you think, oh, everything is going downhill. We are living through the worst period in all of world history. But that is, I mean, mainly the effect of amnesia. We have just forgotten how bad the past really was.
Yeah, and when you see stuff from that time as well, they go, oh, gee, things were so much better in the past back then too. So there is a kind of weird amnesia that takes over.
Yeah.
The truth is, we've never been richer, healthier, more long-lived, more free of disease.
If you just look at some of the stats, it's been pretty incredible. Extreme poverty was 84% of the world population in 1820. Now it's less than 10%. If you look at the decline of child mortality, it's declined by 50% since 1990. Hunger has declined by a third since 1990. If you think about violence and you think that we are living in a very violent times, well, in reality, the amount of war deaths has gone down by 90% since 1946. So, yeah, indeed, we are living in the safest period in all of world history. But again, you don't really get that from the news.
So why are you calling for utopian thinking, like saying, well, let's muck it up and move forward again? Why change it up? Why rather than hang on to what we've got? Why are you calling for a new kind of utopian thinking, Rutger?
Oscar Wilde once said that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at. For it leaves out the one country in which humanity is always landing. I think it's a beautiful quote that shows that we always need to have some vision of where we want to go next. We have achieved fascinating things, great things, tremendous things in the past 200-300 years. The end of slavery, democracy, equal rights for men and women. These were all utopian fantasies once. And the first one who said, we should introduce something like democracy was probably ridiculed and said, that's unrealistic. That goes against human nature. You can't do that. And here we are.
Yeah.
The problem of today is that we have no new vision of where we want to go next. What is our utopian dream for the 21st century?
Here's the problem as I see it with utopia and utopian thinking. We've just come out of the 20th century where utopian thinking was a cross that crucified untold millions of people. And I'm thinking specifically here of the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular, or Maoist China, if you like.
Yeah.
In order to build this perfect new world, well, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, I think was Stalin's phrase as well. This is always the problem with utopian thinking, that, this is the leadership now wants to build a utopia. Who would be an enemy of utopia? And we must do away with the enemies of utopia. And we must also hide the mistakes, because utopia is more important than all of that. This kind of utopian thinking has been extremely dangerous in the past. What lessons do you draw from that, Rutger?
Well, I used to think exactly the same thing, because this is what they taught me at university. I was born in 1988, a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And people of my generation were basically told that the age of grand narratives of big dreams was over. Communism had failed, capitalism had won, good riddance, this is it. This is the end of history.
This is top-down. Communism was a kind of top-down blueprint for all of humanity. And, and we're just... Those kind of blueprints can never be smart enough.
Many intellectuals and journalists drew a bigger lesson, like, we really don't need that big thinking anymore. We only need technocracy, just small-scale tinkering. And the only thing we have to worry about is, what is the next iPhone going to look like? And I used to believe this for a while as well, but then came 2008, the financial crash. And suddenly it seemed, something's going wrong here. Now, we just had 2016, Brexit, rise of Donald Trump. And I think it's obviously clear to millions of people around the globe right now that we can't stick to the status quo. And I started to realize more and more that we had thrown away the child with the bathwater, that we had forgotten that progress is always the realization of utopias, as Oscar Wilde once read, and that there are basically two forms of utopian thinking. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is incredibly dangerous to come up with a blueprint and say, this is the perfect society, and if you don't agree with me, well, too bad for you. But that doesn't mean that we don't need some bigger vision, something to strive for, something that gives people hope, that we can build a movement around.
Conversations with Richard Fidler. Broadcast, podcast, and online.
For me, the most fascinating part of your book was a quiet crisis in the nature of work that you've completely put your finger on, Rutger, which you show that in many countries like Britain, for example, more than a third of people feel that they're in jobs that have absolutely no use whatsoever. Their lives are designed to make or shift things around that have no value for them. And this is inducing this terrible kind of despair. How widespread is this problem of useless, meaningless, and often highly paid useless and meaningless work?
Well, I think it's a huge phenomenon, and I also believe that it is one of the biggest taboos of our time, because not many people are talking about it. I mean, politicians from the left to the right say, we need more jobs, we need more employment. And all economists say, well, we just need more productivity, and as long as that's contributing to GDP, economic growth, then everything is all right. But meanwhile, indeed, I mean, we've got quite some polls now that show that at least a third of the workforce is stuck in a job that they think, I mean, it's not me saying it. Some people might say, well, he's a historian, that's useless. Anyway, it's people defining it for themselves and saying, my job really, it doesn't do anything, I'm not creating much of value. And sometimes even worse, I'm actually destroying value, as many people in the financial sector know about their own jobs.
Yeah, this is a kind of a corrosive feeling too, isn't it? It eats away at your self-esteem over time, doesn't it? This feeling that my job is pointless, or even it does more harm than good.
And what's an even bigger phenomenon is the phenomenon of part-time bullshit jobs. Like, this is pretty huge in journalism as well. So what happens is that, I mean, you want to do investigative journalism, right? I mean, especially if you're young, you still have got dreams and ambitions, etc. But the problem is you don't get any money with that. So what you do is you write ads for companies that you really hate. And then you use that money to do investigative journalism into exactly those kind of companies. So you could call that the circle of bullshit. And you see it in so many professions these days. Consultants, lawyers, bankers, doing work that they think is pretty much destructive, but then using the money they earn with that to do, I don't know, pro bono stuff, or working for another organization that they really care about. It's pretty fascinating, isn't it? That in modern capitalism, we finance the stuff that we think is really important with meaningless nonsense.
This seems to be like a great example of market failure here, because many people are earning very high salaries, almost obscene salaries, for doing work that doesn't create value.
But this goes deeper than market failure. I mean, market failure sort of assumes that there's a fix, that we could have one small tweak to the market, and the market will work properly again. But isn't there supposed to be some kind of invisible hand that gets rid of all this meaningless jobs? I mean, why would employers even want to hire these people that don't really add anything of value? I mean, it strikes at the heart of capitalism, this phenomenon. And
there's a quote from someone at Facebook who says, I saw the finest minds of my generation making clickable ads.
Yeah.
I just want to make really clear that when you talk about bullshit jobs, you're not talking about low status jobs, are you?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I'm not talking about teachers or nurses or garbage collectors. The best way to know whether your job does add anything of value is just to stop doing it and see what happens. So then I thought, let's look at garbage collectors. I mean, there have been a lot of strikes of garbage collectors throughout history. I looked at one in 1968 in New York. It lasted for 6 days. The emergency state had to be declared, and the garbage men won, because New York found out that the city really can't do without them. It's a total disaster if they quit their job. And at that point I thought, has it ever happened throughout world history that the bankers went on strike? Now, this took quite a while to research, because, at some point I thought, well, it probably never happened, until I found one example, and that was in Ireland, 1970. This strike lasted for 6 months. So compared to the garbage collector strike of 6 days, this was 6 months. And nothing much happened, actually.
The famous Irish bankers strike.
Yeah.
Right. Nothing much happened?
Well, I think it's not really, it wasn't very well known, this strike, because nothing much happened. The economy just kept growing. Businesses just kept operating. And the Irish invented their own money system from the bottom up. And after 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work.
All of our economic policies, they rest upon one really key index, which is gross domestic product. GDP is the key figure here, and this central banks take their guidance from this in terms of whether they lower or raise interest rates, or the market looks at those figures and makes conclusions about whether the currency should go up or down. Tell me what you've come to understand about gross domestic product and how good it is as a yardstick of measuring true wealth in a country.
You know, a few years ago in the Dutch news, there was a lot about the Greeks being not productive enough. You know, we had the debt crisis in Europe, and the Greeks were supposedly lazy, spending all our money, and they were not productive enough. That's what the economists said. And then I started researching that, and I found out that the definition of productivity of economists is just the amount of money you earn. So in that sense, you know, my mother, who's a teacher, would not be very productive, and a banker would be incredibly productive. So I started thinking, that's a really weird definition of productivity, isn't it? I also discovered a while later that actually the Greeks have the longest working week in all of Europe. And, you know, my country, Holland, has the shortest working week. So there's something weird going on here. I really think that we live in a time that we should go back to very basic questions, like what is work? What is wealth? Who are the real wealth creators? What is productivity? And indeed, if we look at something like GDP or economic growth, it counts a lot of things as somehow being productive or useful, that in reality, you know, if you look at the real economy, if you look at real people's lives, then we are talking about waste. We are talking about useless stuff that doesn't add anything of value.
What are you calling for? What's a way of shifting people away from these highly paid bullshit jobs, as you call them, into more productive labour? I'm assuming that's what you're calling for here. How might such a thing be accomplished?
I think that a universal basic income will make a huge difference here. I mean, just imagine what is happening right now. I mean, kids around the developed world, they are thinking about what they want to study. And then at some point their parents will tell them, you know, I know you love music, I know you love the arts, I know you like history, but you know, you got to earn money as well in the future, right? You got to pay the bills. So maybe you should go to business school or law school instead. And there they go. With a basic income, if they would know that they could rely on a basic income, they'll say to their parents, you know, I'm going to do what I actually want to do. I'm going to actually contribute something to this society. So that will make a huge difference. The other thing, what will happen is that with a basic income, all the people in really useful jobs will have much more bargaining power. It will also be a universal strike fund. So again, I mean, the garbage collectors, the teachers, the nurses, they can say, you know what, I can always go on strike. I can always fall back on my basic income. So what will happen is that their wages will go up. Now, if you're in a not very useful job, you won't get any additional bargaining power. So your wage will probably go down a little bit. And in the end, the wages in the whole job market will much better reflect the social value of, you know, what people actually contribute. And I think that is actually one of the most important effects of a basic income. It will completely change what we value and reward in our society.
Rutger, one of the things you talk about in your book quite a bit is the whole concept of leisure and leisure time. And I do have memories of this. I do have memories of this from the 20th century, of leisure, yes, from the 20th century of these predictions that were made. And I can remember them being made in my childhood and early teens, often by science fiction writers, that the crisis we're going to have in the 21st century is a superabundance of leisure time. Yeah. We won't know what to do with all the leisure time we have. And this will in turn create a spiritual crisis, a strange spiritual malaise. People will be lying around on couches, going to psychiatrists thinking, my God, how do I do things with my life from now on? It didn't pan out that way, did it?
Not really.
No. This country particularly. You know, this country was famous for knocking off at midday on a Friday. This country was one of the first to introduce a proper working week, a living wage, all those things.
In Melbourne,
you know?
The stonemasons of Melbourne were the first to get the 8-hour working day. There's a monument for that in Melbourne that I visited just last week.
we were pretty proud. For most of my childhood, Australia was it would often castigate itself for being a bit of a lazy country. I just don't think that's the case anymore. Everyone I know works really long hours at their job. What do you think has gone wrong there, if indeed something has gone wrong, and how what ought to be done to address this problem?
Well, again, I think it's really important that we remember that up until the 1970s, almost all the economists, sociologists, philosophers all believed that we would be working less and less and less. So this is not some crazy prediction that was just made by some science fiction writers. I mean, the British economist John Maynard Keynes believed we would be working just 15 hours in 2030. This was basically a very mainstream opinion that boredom was going to be the big challenge of the future. Everything changed around 1980 throughout the developed world. There are usually two explanations given. The most popular explanation is consumerism. So we keep on buying stuff we don't need to impress people we don't like, which is probably a part of the answer. But let's also be honest. I mean, most of us don't really produce anything in our jobs that other people consume, right? I mean, our iPhones, all the crap that we buy is being produced either by robots or by wage slaves in third world countries, right? It's not being produced by us. Most of us are sitting in the office, sending emails to other people all day, writing reports no one really reads. So I think that the rise of meaningless jobs is a much better explanation, actually. And this is just something that all these great thinkers from the 20th century underestimated. They underestimated how adaptive capitalism can be. They underestimated its extraordinary potential to come up with new meaningless jobs. And I actually believe this can go on for a lot longer. I mean, now it might be 30%, but it could be 50% in the future. It could be 80%. It could be 100%. I mean, at some point, we could live in a society where everyone is just pretending to work, while in reality, we're just browsing Facebook.
The upshot of all these extra hours that are being worked is it's put a choke on civic life throughout the developed countries. You know, community organisations, volunteer organisations, churches, unions, all those things, their ranks are thinning out. It's harder to get people to show up for stuff. Yeah. I mean, whatever hours you have left after your job have to be devoted to caring for your children or your parents. There's led to a kind of a real diminishment in the quality of life, this superabundance of work hours.
And in the meaning of life as well, I believe. I'm not saying that we should work less so that we can sit on the couch and watch Netflix all day. Actually, it's the country with the longest working weeks where people watch the most television, which is pretty logical.
Say that again? Say that again?
It's the countries with the longest working weeks, like the US, Turkey, Japan, where people watch the most amount of television.
Is that because when they get home, you're just so tired?
Exactly.
Or you feel like doing
it's the only thing TV. You can do. You can just watch Gilmore Girls and
that's it.
Hope for better times. That's it. While in countries with much shorter working weeks, we see that people devote much more time to their kids, to the elderly, to volunteers work, to participating in their local communities. So in that sense, I think we need to do less paid work in order to do more.
The thing that's about to crash into this ever-increasing amount of work we're doing is the rise of roboticisation, automation in the workplace, which are starting to eat away at jobs, the job market at the moment. How do you see that intersecting with this crisis of overwork, if you like?
Well, there are some people, especially in Silicon Valley, who believe that, you know, when the robots come, and some predictions say that 50% of all jobs will be gone in 20 years. And then people in Silicon Valley say, well, a universal basic income is just inevitable. It's there's no alternative. But the thing is, in the 70s, they believed that as well. But we still haven't got that basic income. So maybe it's not inevitable. Maybe we need to fight for this and actually create a movement around it. I think technology just creates possibilities. But, you know, there are different roads that we can take in the future. Well, as I said, I mean, we could add many more meaningless jobs.
Yes, the advent of the light bulb meant a crisis in the candle factory. I mean, didn't it, of course? But again and again, we've seen a situation where a whole form of work is made obsolete. Then humans then inevitably create new forms of things to say and do and think and create and all those things. So
sure.
Will that change? Do you see that changing?
No, and this is the argument that economists always make. You know, there will always be new jobs. And indeed, that has happened in the past 200 years. My point is just that many of these jobs do not provide people with meaning in their lives. So that I think that we should get rid of the dogma, the old dogma, which is, well, I'm now saying it's an old dogma, but actually it's a fairly recent idea, that life is just about paid work. I mean, people didn't believe that in the 16th century. So we should get rid of that dogma and just redefine what life is all about.
Just the last couple of years, the whole issue of inequality has hit world leaders like a brick through a window. It suddenly appeared. Maybe it was there all the time. I don't know, but it
was there all the time. I can assure you.
Yeah. So how is this?
Growing and growing.
Well, that's right. I mean, the increasing automation of work, is this increasing inequality at the same time?
It's certainly one of the reasons, but there are many, many other reasons as well. You know, the decline of labor unions, the growth of the financial sector. There are a whole plethora of reasons here. I mean, we've all heard about the book of Thomas Piketty. I mean, we didn't read it, but no. We know what's basically the argument is. And it is that, especially wealth inequality is growing and growing and growing.
Are you seeing politicians or leaders being willing to change their thinking on this matter? I mean, we are still stuck in a kind of paradigm of the kind of economics and philosophies, if you like, of the 1980s at the moment. And that itself had overturned a previous orthodoxy. I think we just kind of move from one orthodox ideas to another over time. That's what human history is, really, isn't it?
Well, as a historian, I really believe in the power of ideas. And new ideas, they don't start in places like Westminster or Washington or Canberra. That's where they end. But they start.
They don't start in Canberra, no.
They start with crazy people who are on the fringes and are first dismissed. I mean, just look at someone like Donald Trump. We dismissed him just a few years ago as completely. We thought it was completely unrealistic, the idea that he would ever become president. The whole phenomenon of Donald Trump is just the endpoint of a quite long historical process that started probably 20, 30 years ago. It's the same with the idea of neoliberalism. That started in the 50s already until it took over in the 70s and became really powerful in the 80s and crashed in 2008. So it takes some time, but I think it's important not to look at the centers of what we call political power, but look on the fringes and what new ideas are starting there that might take over the world when a new crisis hits us.
The most contentious, I think, proposal in your book is the one that concerns open borders. You're calling for a world where borders essentially are dropped and people can pass backwards and forwards across borders pretty much the way goods do, more or less, these days. I can't see that getting up anytime soon. I mean, strong borders are... whether you agree with them or not, nonetheless, there's large majorities for support of strong borders in this country in particular, increasingly so in the United States and in the UK. That's what led to Brexit or something. Why are you calling for an open border system? And doesn't this mean like half the world's disadvantage suddenly turn up on our front doorstep suddenly?
Well, it's definitely the most radical idea in my book. I mean, compared to basic income, we could do that tomorrow. And as I said, we should have done it yesterday. But maybe the idea of open borders is also the most important utopian idea that is out there right now. Let's just zoom out a little bit and think about what our world would look like if we live in the year 2200. What would the biggest injustice of our time be? I think it's pretty obvious. It's borders. I mean, borders cause inequality on a massive scale, much bigger than national inequality, is global inequality. If you have the same skill set as someone in Australia, you earn about 10 times less if you live in Nigeria. And that's just because you were born in the wrong country. Now, obviously, we have a long list of objections against immigration and diversity, and most of them are basically wrong.
We have a pretty substantial migration program in Australia. We also have a refugee program. We don't have open borders. Immigration's one thing, but open borders are a whole other thing. I mean, it's not a question between on or off. Is it like you put up the fence and let no one in? No country does that. But the sudden arrival, the sudden radical arrival of very large groups of people into your society that don't speak the language, perhaps have lower levels of education so they can't plug into the local economy, this can create terrible crises in the communities of the places that they come to, and may in turn become counterproductive as a huge reaction then takes place against them.
Exactly, and that's also why it's a utopian vision, something that we should strive for and take one small step after another in that direction.
So
but I think it's important
you're not causing for dropping the borders tomorrow. In other words.
No, I'm not saying that. I think you should always experiment first. I mean, I'm saying the same thing when it comes to basic income. Let's do more experiments. Let our current welfare state become more like a basic income. It's very important that we have a radical vision for the future, but that we are very practical about what we want to do tomorrow and take one small step after another, and be open to learn along the way, and maybe even change our opinion if something's not really working out the way we hoped it would. But it's important to remember, though, that immigration is by far the most powerful weapon we've got against global poverty, and that most of the objections we have against it, like, oh, these are all criminals or terrorists and they're lazy and they will just go on welfare and do nothing, it's just not true. If we look at the data, if we look at the mountain of economic evidence we've got, it's just not true. It's not a coincidence, and again, I say this as a historian, that throughout world history, all the great nations and empires were founded on the strength of immigrants. From the Roman Empire to the United States, there are lots of examples here. And it's also important to remember that actually, I mean, this is happening right now in the US and Europe, is that the higher the walls are, the more illegal immigrants you're going to get. because people will still come. This happened in the US. But they don't go back anymore. There's some fascinating research that shows that in the 60s and the 70s, hundreds of thousands illegal immigrants from Mexico came to the US, but 80% of them went back to their home country, which is logical. I mean, that's where you came from, and you probably miss it. But then they started to militarize the border in the 80s and started building higher and higher walls. Nowadays, about 15 to 20% of all illegal immigrants go back. The same thing is happening in Europe. The higher the walls, the more immigrants you're going to get.
In 2011, I happened to be in New York City, and I wandered down to have a look at the Occupy Wall Street demonstration that was going on in Wall Street. And this was very much in reaction to the outrages performed by the financial community, which led to the crash of 2008. And maybe I just went there on a bad day. I don't know. I saw a lot of guys drumming. I saw people in tents. I didn't see a program. I didn't see like a list of ideas, like this ought to happen. And in fact, the leaders at the time said, we're not here to come up with an alternative set of policies. We just want to register our protest. Okay. But is this a problem with the left at large, that they don't bring forward proposals like this at the moment?
I'd say that the problem with the left these days is that it only knows what it's against. It's against a lot of things these days. I mean, it's against homophobia, against racism, against austerity, against the establishment, against mainstream media, against consumerism, against growth. There was even a book recently published by a famous New York intellectual, and the book is called Against Everything. and the first chapter of that book is against exercise. Now, I'm not saying I'm not against all those things, but we also need to be for something. I mean, Martin Luther King, he did not say, I have a nightmare. He had a dream, right? And we need that. We need a dream, a vision of a better society to build a movement, to give people hope that it actually matters what we do in the here and now, and that we can create a better world.
Ultimately, this is politics we're talking right now, isn't it? This is politics. I think that all politics, anyone's political system of beliefs, is rooted or rests fundamentally upon a view of human nature. What's your view of human nature?
I have a very crazy and dangerous view of human nature.
Oh dear. All right, come on, let's hear it.
I believe that most people are pretty nice. I believe that most people are creative, social, that we want to make something of our lives, and that we are completely misguided by what the news is telling us every day. I mean, the news is about exceptions, about things that go wrong, about corrupt politicians, about terrorists, about criminals.
Have you driven a car on the road lately? You see what people are like on the road?
But that's what you remember. I mean, we have got a very bad memory here. What you remember is, the few incidents that we have in a week or a month or whatever. But the majority of our interactions with other people are quite pleasant, actually. I think you could call this the banality of good. It's just what we are like as a species. But the thing is that we often assume the worst in other people. And this is where things really go wrong, because then we start to base our democracy and our social welfare system on the idea that most people want to corrupt the system. And we start making laws for the 1% instead of the 99%. This is happening in the welfare state all the time. So we've got all kind of anti-fraud regulations, etc. I mean, just last week in the news in Australia, drug testing. I mean, it hardly exists. People on welfare money wasting their money on something like that. But now everyone has got to go through that humiliating test. What kind of collateral damage will that get us? I think so many times we just have a completely wrong idea of what most of us are really like.
When you talk to people about this idea of a universal basic income, what do they say about what that would mean for them and what it would mean for that guy down the road?
Well, that's so funny. I mean, if you'd ask people, what would you do with the basic income? 99% of all people say, don't worry about me. I've got dreams. I've got ambitions. Maybe I'm going to quit that meaningless job of mine and I'm going to, contribute something to society that I really care about. But then if you ask them, what will other people do with the basic income? They say, oh, other people. Well, they'll probably waste it.
Sit on their asses and watch TV.
Yeah. And that's, we've been brainwashed about what other people are like.
It's been such a pleasure, and I really thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
This is Conversations with Richard Feifler on ABC Radio.
Rutger Bregman's book is called Utopia for Realists, and I spoke to him last week, and since then it's been revealed in Hillary Clinton's new book that she was considering proposing a universal basic income at the 2016 presidential election, but she didn't. I'm Richard Feidler.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.